Well, it's great to see so many of you. When I first agreed to teach at Development Planning Unit 15 years ago, I said, I have one condition. I'm only going to have 12 people on my course. The idea being that we could fit round a table. I look with horror at the fact that I've got 50 of you signed up for my course, but I very much look forward to seeing you next week. Now, this is really an introductory lecture about urbanisation and about poverty, because all of our concerns include these. And this picture is from Cebu. It's an informal settlement in Cebu. Now, the weird thing is that according to World Bank poverty lines, no one is poor in this informal settlement. So something's going wrong with the definition of poverty if these aren't included. I'm very encouraged that some of you are tweeting already. I have a lot of fun on Twitter. I think it has become a very useful way of having informal chats, arguments, discussions, and occasionally character assassinations. So those of you that are tweeting, great. Those of you that you have the chance to experiment with Twitter to see whether you enjoy it. If you don't enjoy it, don't do it. My Twitter name makes you struggle a little bit with my impossible surname. So, 1 in 7 of the world's population live in informal settlements like these. 1 in 7. Mostly without safe water, mostly without toilets, mostly without health care, without electricity, with household waste collection, without schools, without the rule of law, with no address, no formal identity, insecure tenure, and obviously the risk of fire. Yet, none of these people would be classified as poor according to the World Bank's poverty line, and I'll come to why a little bit later. I've included some slides. You can get this whole presentation on Moodle, and I've included some web links that will be of interest to you, which I'm not going to use today. But this is a map of the world and the different regions of the world in 1800 and in 1900. And it's showing all urban centres with more than 750,000 inhabitants. In 1800, there was only 18 million urban dwellers in the entire world. That's Mumbai's population today. Only 2 cities had more than 1 million, London and what was then Peking. By 1900, there were around 230 million urban dwellers. Now just watch the map as we go to 1950 and we go to 2025. I'm going to take you back through that sequence. 1800 and 1900, you can hardly see the dots. You can see a little bit in Europe, a little bit in North America's east coast. What's interesting about this is that the world's biggest economies are the ones that concentrate most of the large cities. There is an economic logic to where large cities grow. This is also showing where private capital is investing. It's showing where people are moving mostly. It's showing where economic growth is rapid. And it's showing where infrastructure investments are being made to attract private enterprises. And some of you will have seen this is China's amazingly ambitious scheme to link its economy with Europe and with Asia through both sea routes and land routes. Now, this is the sort of infrastructure that will change the distribution of city populations. We change the distribution of city populations because there's underlying economic or occasionally conflict driving those changes. Does anyone recognize where that is? Shanghai. That's Shanghai. I'll go back just so you see it. The speed of transformation in China challenges us all. But look at that transformation in 20, 25 years. So we've got this big agenda. We talk about cities, we look at globalization. But really to understand what's going on, we have to take our focus down. And here we're looking at Nairobi. And those of you that know Nairobi, you will see up at the north the areas where the rich live, the areas where this enormous UN complex is based. And then, if we look carefully, we can see Kibera to the kind of to the left of Nairobi. Kibera, one of the biggest informal settlements. We can look at Embakasi, that's out close to the airport, notable for having the highest child mortality rate in Nairobi. We can look at the airport. We can look at Westlands. You can see Westlands. Westlands is where foreign consultants working with the UN stay so that they avoid the congestion of traffic if you try to come from the centre of Nairobi. And here we can see Kibera much more closely. What's unclear is whether the massive demolition in Kibera last month to clear the site for a highway, whether that's actually shown. I couldn't get the date of this satellite image. But if you can look at Kibera and you can see the highway system to the south, that is certainly part of the system that is legitimating the destruction of Kibera. Here we can see Huruma. Huruma is important. It's an informal settlement where the inhabitants negotiated agreement between landlords and tenants and the government. And so it turned from an informal settlement with lots of conflict between tenants and landlords into a settlement where everyone's needs were met. You can see Dandora, famous for having one of the first large site and service projects. You can see Matari, but you can see Matari more clearly here. And you can see how tightly the very high density informal settlement is close to the Matari River, and of course with terrible flooding. And we can look at the complication of Matari. This is the land tenure map, and this is a gross simplification. Or we can look at Mukuru. Mukuru has 100,000 households, 100,000 households in this enormous informal settlement with almost no provision for water, sanitation, drainage, healthcare, schools, the rule of law. But if we actually walk through Mukuru, we find that Mukuru is actually lots of settlements aggregated together. And here you can see the different, almost villages that have emerged in Mukuru, each with their own name. One is called Vietnam, which I think was reflecting the level of conflict that they were experiencing at the time. So if we're trying to understand urban change on the ground, it's pretty complicated. You've got the drivers of change for each city. You've got individuals, households, choosing to move, choosing to stay, choosing to invest, choosing to build where there's land that's possible. You've got a huge diversity of enterprises, some coming in, some leaving, some expanding, some contracting. Strong influence of government laws, but very often strong influence of government laws that push the economy outside of government laws. In most sub-Saharan African cities, 70 to 80% of the workforce works in the informal economy. Then in so many cities, this huge, complex, largely hidden land and housing market operating illegally, but very often with political support. It makes it very difficult to understand a city and how it's growing or changing or declining by getting to understand all these key drivers of change. And then there's the service sector for international bureaucrats. In Nairobi, lots of aid agency staff complain about the fact that too many people are moving to Nairobi. So you ask them, do you have a driver? Yes. Do you have a maid? Yes. Do you have a cook? Yes. Do you have a security guard? Yes. Do you have a gardener? Yes. Where do you think they come from? In a sense, the elite don't like people moving to urban areas in the abstract, but then use them all for all the services when they actually are there. I'm interested in definitions. If you get a definition right, it's very useful in isolating or identifying a particular issue. If you get it wrong, it can be disastrous. So, for instance, if I was to say adequate provision for water, what would you think? Adequate provision, adequate provision, adequate provision. Well, in the tap all 24 hours, safe, affordable. So there's different definitions beginning to creep in as we try to establish what is adequate provision for water. How do we define what income an individual or household needs to meet their basic needs, which is, after all, what's the whole point of defining poverty? You can look at these. There's a lot of definitions of urbanisation. I'm using the definition, the increase in the proportion of the national population living in urban areas, which is different from Wiki and different from Princeton. It's the UN's definition, it's not my definition. Now, here's some advice to you. Do not get to take as an assignment writing about sustainable development or about resilience. There is such ambiguity, there's such confusion as to what those terms use that they've ceased to have a meaning. Now, the UN agency responsible for urban areas, in its last meeting, developed a new urban agenda. This is meant to be the urban agenda that's going to see us through to 2030 or beyond. The new urban agenda mentions sustainable 136 times in a 20-page document. And if you can believe it, here are how they use it. Sustainable debt management, what the hell is that? Sustainable economic growth? I've only got to F. Sustainable land. What does sustainable land mean? Sustainable performing arts? It's still going. It's almost as if by repetition we get clarity, but it's by repetition that we get a complete lack of clarity. Gender is mentioned 16 times in this 20-page document, but there's no clear articulation of what a gender strategy should be. Sustainable economic growth gets mentioned 7 times. Now, here's the puzzle. 20 pages on the urban agenda for the next 15 to 20 years. There's no mention of mayors. There's no mention of mayors. There is no mention of decentralization. There's no mention of participatory budgeting. There's no mention of healthy cities programs, all of which are trying to drive progressive developmental agendas. Civil society's competence and capacity is completely ignored. The United Nations loves to have discussions of vulnerable groups or people in vulnerable situations, and everyone competes to see how to make their list longer than anyone else. So according to the UN, vulnerable groups are women, children, youth, older persons, people with disabilities, migrants, indigenous, local communities, refugees, and others. By my calculation, the only people that aren't vulnerable are men who aren't youth during their working age. Look, don't get me wrong. These categories are very important for looking to see whether there's discrimination, whether there's inequality. But just having this enormous long list of vulnerable groups means that you don't actually address why they're vulnerable and how they can be worked with to bring them out of that vulnerability. Here's some general comments from the literature. This is from United Nations literature, World Resources Institute literature, World Watch Institute. Health of hundreds of millions threatened by urban explosion, explosive growth, speed of urban change unprecedented, fast-growing cities with the worst problems. Half the world lives in cities. Cities generate most of all greenhouse gas emissions, which are driving us towards dangerous climate change. Megacities grow rapidly. Now, all these statements have one characteristic in common. What is it? You're going to have to speak louder. Not what I'm looking for. They're wrong. Every single one of these statements, there's a huge, strong empirical base to show that they're wrong. And I'm hoping that by the end of this lecture that you will have agree with me that these are the myths that we've got to replace. Now, I've worked with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the last 15 years as part-time. And some of the discussions about climate change have coming down to this. You can say the same about some of the discussions about urbanization. Where's this? Anyone who lives in this city is not allowed to say. And I'm guessing that one or two of you probably do live in this city. I was there last week. Hong Kong, Mumbai. There's photos of Mumbai and stretches of Mumbai that actually have more skyscrapers than Manhattan. In a sense, I'm showing it to you as a reminder that some of the cities we're working with, including Mumbai, where 30% of the population live in informal settlements, actually have enormous wealth. It's in Mumbai that the most expensive house in the world is actually located. It costs $1 billion for one house, a 43-story house in Mumbai, 500 servants. I think you have to get servants for the servants when you get that high. But why all the negatives about cities? Cities have most of the world's most healthy citizens. They have most of the world's economically active population. They generate most of the GDP. They're incredible concentrations of culture, historic heritage, fun, social and economic and political innovation. Somehow we've failed to realize the value of cities and the importance of cities as political entities driving change. If you're working in the IPCC on climate change and you work with national governments, not a lot of good news. If you work with city governments, you get a lot of good news as cities are making commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, completely independent of national government. Cities have always been a place where social change and social innovation has been driven, as you can see, for instance, in participatory budgeting. We need to get back to recognizing city governments' power to act, to push, to promote, to support, to help. And surprisingly, there's a large potential of cities actually to combine very high quality lifestyles with very low greenhouse gas emissions. Copenhagen, one of the nicest cities to be in, gorgeous city to walk in, gorgeous city to bike in, has one of the lowest greenhouse gas emission per person of any high income nation, any city in high income nation. So, economic logic to where rapid urbanization takes place. Most of the problems we see from rapid urbanization are the lack of governance, the lack of appropriate response, not the speed of change. Cities provide many advantages for improving health. I'm not connected to the internet, so I can't show this little film. This little film is worth watching. So when you get onto Moodle and you download this, what it's showing is a train coming past. And you watch the train, you watch the train, you watch the train, and then the train suddenly stops. And all these shops that are this far from the railway suddenly go onto the track, and it turns into a teeming live vegetable and fish market, showing how cleverly low-income groups appropriate space, in this instance for their livelihood needs. So, no, these you know. One of the difficulties, when we talk of urban centres, they include, in some countries, settlements as small as 200 people, through to the 20 million plus, 30 million plus. It's very difficult to talk about urban centres in one category. And here definitions matter. If India decided that Sweden's Census Bureau should advise them on the next census in India and define urban areas in India as if they were in Sweden, and India becomes 85% urban. Because for Sweden, 200 persons clustered in a settlement is urban. That would make almost all villages in India urban. So definitions matter. the assumptions underlying definitions matter too. If we go to the UN, you can get this enormous database about city populations. And all of them have city populations from 1950 to 2020 and then through to 2030, 2040. And here are the plots that show the population of Kabul and the population of Lubumbashi over this period. What happens if we only use census data, recognizing that it's only census data that has the possibility of giving us accurate figures? That's the only... So you can not project over a 50, 60, 70, 80-year period on the basis of one or two data plots. There's many nations that have had only 1, 2 or 3 censuses in the last 50, 60, 70 years. So we really don't know a lot about current urban populations. You've also got censuses that, for a while in some nations, censuses gave populations that then allocated funding from national government. So if you were a state governor in Nigeria, for instance, you exaggerated your population 2 or 3-fold because that got you a lot more federal government oil money. So there's political reasons why censuses can be compromised by political interests. I won't mention Trump at this point. The World Bank made a big deal that sub-Saharan Africa was urbanizing rapidly in the 1990s, even though its economy wasn't growing. But there was no data for any of the sub-Saharan African nations as to the speed of change in their urban populations. So we need to look at what drives urbanization, and economic growth that concentrates in particular spatial units is what is driving most city growth. Or if you like, the concentration of profit-seeking enterprises. Why do they concentrate? They concentrate because certain locations have particular advantages for them. Advantages in access to markets, access to consumers, access to information, a diverse labour pool. Also the concentration of schools and jobs. We know what drives urbanisation. What we haven't learnt adequately is how to cope with the speed with which it grows in response to, very, very often, considerable prosperity. So we could look at this map as a map of where capital is concentrated, as well as where people have concentrated. There's really 3 global milestones. In 2008, more than half the world's population lived in urban areas. But it was in 1980 that more than half the world's labour force worked in urban enterprises. And it was back in 1940 that more than half the world's GDP was generated by industry and services. So rather than being random, levels of urbanisation track very closely the percent of the labour force in industry and services and the percent of GDP in industry and services. We've got to see urbanisation's underlying drivers to begin to understand how to address their needs. I think we've said all this before. Just this comment at the end that cities need large economies, megacities need very large economies. So the megacities are concentrated in the mega economies. There's an economic logic to where the megacities are located. And we can look at how the distribution of cities has changed. This is the distribution of the world's 100 largest cities. And you can see this decline in Europe. Europe had more than half the world's 100 largest cities in 1900, and now it's come down dramatically. In Asia, it's grown dramatically. In Latin America, growing quite strongly. But if we extend the time period back to 1800, you get a different picture. You actually get Asia having most of the world's largest cities in 1800 and losing that because of the economic changes and the changes in economic power, the changes in political power. And Europe's really returning to what it was previously, not suffering an unprecedented drop. So we need to be cautious in making generalizations. Many of the world's largest cities are growing very slowly, which is, I think, a surprise to many people. Rio de Janeiro had more people moving out than in the last inter-census period. The same with Mexico City. The same with Buenos Aires. The same with Kolkata. Seoul stopped being a megacity because its population had gone just above 10 million, which was the definition for megacity, and then shrank to 9.9 million. With so little data, with so little census data for much of sub-Saharan Africa, I don't think we know really what's happening in urban trends in sub-Saharan Africa. It'll need a new round of censuses, hopefully accurate censuses. What we also see is that as nations urbanize, as economies urbanize, so the potential for a more decentralized pattern of urban development develops. And if you've got strong local governments, if there's been strong local government, strong decentralization, you begin to get different patterns. So in Brazil, Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro have been losing investment to Curitiba, Porto Alegre and Vitoria. In India, there's a whole new generation of big cities coming up that compete against the classic four, Chennai, Kolkata, Delhi and Mumbai. Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune. These in turn will be challenged by other smaller, newer cities that come up. So, this fear that everyone's going to be in mega cities is vastly exaggerated. And then, of course, there's climate change. Can you, at the back, read that text? Okay, just leave you to read that text just for a moment. You see, national governments can make these amazing commitments to end poverty, to remove dangerous climate change, knowing full well that they're not going to be held to account for it when they return to their own country. So we got this imbalance between these very bold commitments made and actual delivery on the ground. And of course, if I'm a politician, I'm elected to London, I can make amazing commitments for 2030 to 2040 to 2050, and I'll be long gone by the time there's evidence to show whether I was right. So how should urban poverty be defined? Who should define it? It's very difficult to define urban poverty because it has so many aspects. Obviously, awful housing, makeshift housing. Very often less than 2 square meters per person. Can you imagine living in a one room flat? Well, it's not a flat, a one room. Where there's less than 2 square meters per person. You've got inadequate provision for water, for sanitation, for drainage, for garbage collection. You struggle to get sufficient food. You have a very limited asset base. If you lose your job, if you get sick or ill, it's very difficult to keep the family fed. You face all sorts of discrimination in the jobs you apply for by caste, by gender, by age. Your informal settlements are not served by emergency services, so that people who are seriously ill or injured, or there's fires, the emergency services can't get anywhere near you. Lack of education, illegality, lack of protection from the law. Informal settlements, very often the communities have to form their own policing because government police forces refuse to operate there. Voicelessness and powerlessness within political systems, and lack of transport services. Now, I'm sure we could list 3 or 4 or 5 more aspects of poverty if we spent a bit of time doing it. So, in response to this, what do the major... that's also just to show you that the 8 core aspects of urban poverty in the blue ones and examples of what contributes to them on the outside. This wasn't intended for you to read, but I'm interested for you to read it when you look through the PowerPoint on your own computer. And of course, there's different impacts depending on your age, your sex, your gender, your migrant status, your health status. So, what do you see here? What do you see here? Anyone like to hazard a guess where this is? $400,000 people in a very, very central city district. There's a kind of vague buzz, but I can't actually hear any suggestions. Dharavi. The best week of my year is I go and spend a week in Dharavi with Jokin Apurtham, who's the head of the National Slum Dwellers Federation, and trying to trace all the tricks and the political strategies they use to... And you could see this as a slum that should be bulldozed. If I was in real estate, I would die to be able to bulldoze Dharavi because the location is so valuable, so central. You can see it as a place for breakfast. Those of you that have been to India know what idlis are. Idlis are a wonderful breakfast, and Dharavi has the best idlis in Mumbai. You can see this as cheap accommodation for low-income groups. You can rent space in Dharavi. You can rent beds by the hour, what's called the hotbed system. You sleep for 8 hours, and so every bed is generating revenue from 3 different users, but obviously the price is much lower. It's a fantastic location for access to labour markets. Lots of employment in Dharavi too. You can also see it as a compact city with very low greenhouse gas emissions. This is an extremely efficient economy in terms of resource use and waste. You can also see it as a massive contributor to Mumbai's economy. Estimates suggest that Dharavi generates $500 million, $600 million worth of goods and services in any year. So we've established that urban poverty is complex, has many aspects. So how to measure it? The standard approach is to measure the cost of food, and that's it. That's it, that's all. That's the only data collection you do. So what about all the things that people need, that they have to pay for, that are non-food needs? You usually have to pay for housing. In Dharavi, most of the people renting accommodation are spending 30 to 40% of their income on rent. They're having to buy water. Sanitation is often provided in communal blocks where you have to pay each time you use it. And even if it seems cheap per use, if you've got a whole family using a community toilet 4 times a day, 5 people in the family, that's 20 times you need to use it. That gets expensive. Having to pay for electricity where you've got it, having to pay for healthcare privately because there's no public service, keeping children at school, transport. All these are serious costs facing low-income urban dwellers, but none of them get factored in to most poverty lines. Using different criteria, you can put poverty at almost any level. One of the most amazing was urban areas in Kenya, where according to one distinguished couple of researchers, only 1% of the population was poor, against a survey the next year that suggested that 49% of the population were poor. The UN, the World Bank, and Bill and the Melinda Gates Foundation absolutely love this graph because this claims to show the incredible success of development in reducing poverty. And according to the criteria used, which is $1 a day, that then got adjusted to $1.25 and now $1.90. I'm sure this is probably factually correct, but is $1.90 a day so low that it's missing most of the deprivations? Oh, sorry, I was one behind. This was the graph you were meant to see. But they're also polite. No one put up their hands and said, we can't understand a word you're talking about. Okay, now I'm going to give you some really, really scary statistics. There's no urban poverty in China. World Bank. There's no urban poverty in the Middle East. World Bank. There's no urban poverty in North Africa. or Central Asia. In Latin America, over 90% of the urban population are not poor. Now, these are nonsense statistics. Yet these are trotted out the entire time by the development community to legitimate themselves. Look how much we've made poverty drop. If you were to change the poverty line to something that was realistic in terms of all the non-food needs, it would change the picture completely. This is the population defined as poor by the $1 a day poverty line in a range of nations. This is the poverty line defined by national governments as they try to incorporate non-food needs into food needs into the poverty line. And you can see how much they vary. Okay, if the $1 a day poverty line is valid everywhere, yeah? What about for you? What happens if your funding source decided that $1 a day was adequate because it was above the poverty line, and all of you only got £1.40 a day for all your living expenses, or £42 a month? Of course, this is ridiculous. But so is the application of this $1.40 a day poverty line to so much of the urban population in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Back to definitions. The percent of the urban population with improved drinking water supply looks really impressive. I hope you can you read these at the back? You can see these. That this is showing that, Nigeria, 80% of the urban population with improved water. Countries, very poor countries, Haiti, even Haiti is not doing too badly. Malawi, close to 100%, Indonesia close to 100%. Look at the definitions. Improved water includes piped water, public tap, standpipe, tube well, borehole, protected spring, or dug well or rainwater. Now, setting the bar so low that of course it seems that governments are doing really well in providing water. Improved water, as defined by the World Health Organization, is not safe water. They've admitted that much of the improved water is fecally contaminated. There's no mention in improved water about affordability. Definitions matter because they define what you're measuring. And it's so easy to hide poor performance by changing the criteria, by changing the definition. What happens if we replaced improved water with water piped to premises? Now that's a better indicator. That's not saying that it's safe, that's not saying it's regular, it's not saying that it's not fecally contaminated, but at least if it's piped to each person's home, it would represent a much better quality than improved water. Look how the performance changes. So Nigeria, instead of having 80% of its urban population with improved water, it has 4% of its urban population with water piped to premises. Definitions matter. Imagine you are in the Ministry of Health, and I came to tell you that 96 to 99% of the urban population has improved sanitation. And I can do that in Tanzania, Uganda, or Zambia, or Malawi. In a sense, you'll say, great, we've done a good job. Now we must focus on other things. But only 5 to 10% actually has good quality sanitation. The rest have very, very poor quality sanitation. In 2015, these are the 3 different figures that you can use for provision for water. Provision for sanitation. Each of which has a definition, each of which has some legitimacy. And of course it's ridiculous, the difference between 712 million and 2.3 billion. I was in Delhi 6 years ago. I don't usually move in such exalted company, but I was actually with the Minister of Housing and Urban Development. Very smart, intelligent woman. And the week before, the UN had announced that India's slum population had fallen by 60 million. So I asked the minister, this is an amazing achievement. How is it that you managed to reduce the slum population by 60 million? She said, I don't know. So she called over her senior bureaucrat, senior civil servant, and said, where do these statistics come from? Madam, we don't know. So we began to dig and we began to look. What had happened? The UN had changed the definition for improved water and sanitation, lowering the standards. So the 60 million had moved out merely because they'd changed the bar, they'd changed the definition. This happens constantly. Whenever you see in the Sustainable Development Goals or any other discussions how well we're doing with provision for water and sanitation, remember this, and remember that it's largely based on incredibly inaccurate definitions. So if we were measuring poverty with an attempt to actually measure the deprivations that low-income people suffer, this is a list that's probably quite useful. Income, assets, housing conditions, infrastructure, services, safety net, the rule of law and policing in their informal settlement. Perhaps more importantly, it's good quality water. The poverty schemes that provide water usually provide such poor quality water, such poor quality provision. Affordable services, not just services, but affordable services. And most importantly, the urban poor with a right to engage in how their own needs are addressed. We can look at illegal housing and all the ways that it's linked to poverty, but we can also look to pro-poor urban development and strong support for slum and squatter upgrading that turns this on its head. So here, illegal housing is one of the key causes of poverty. Here, moving out of illegal housing is one of the key drivers for people moving out of poverty. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights. The Asian Coalition for Housing Rights is one of the most progressive and interesting organizations, driving policy change, driving innovation, driving community-led development. And Sumsuk Bunyabancha, the head of the Asian Coalition, who's an old friend of mine, said once, David, why don't we ask our grassroots leaders how they would define and measure poverty? That seemed a bit odd. They're not professionals, they're not experts, they're not statisticians. But we persevered, and a small amount of money was raised, and groups of grassroots leaders from 6 Asian nations met in Bangkok. And we talked about how poverty is defined and measured. And they got very enthusiastic about saying, well, we'll measure poverty ourselves. We'll go back to our settlements. We will do very careful assessments of how much money people need. And we'll come and meet and share our experiences. And so that's what they did. And like good researchers, they did lots of household interviews. And they came up with, this is the bottom poverty line, the extreme poverty line. Hang on. If you look at the columns going from left to right, you've got Nepal extreme poverty and Nepal poverty. Sri Lanka extreme poverty, Sri Lanka poverty. What they did was to look at what they defined as extreme poverty, which is not managing and only just managing, and treated them as separate. But look how much they differ from the US $1.25 a day poverty line that was being applied by external agencies. In our survey, we found nobody could live on $1.25 a day. Impossible to live with this amount. You would have to gather leftover food from rubbish piles in the street. What's the reason for setting such a low minimum amount of money? Is it a conspiracy of some kind against the poor? We don't want the World Bank telling us where our own poverty stops and starts. Don't get confused. These aren't NGO staff. These are not NGO staff. These are elected grassroots leaders who come representing, in a sense, the urban poor constituency. And then Ruby Haddad, one of the wisest people I've worked with from the Philippines, works with the Philippines Homeless People's Federation. So many poverty studies are being done everywhere, but done by people who have never been poor, never been evicted, never had to survive on earnings that were never enough. There's a hyperlink to the full paper. And it was interesting to ask the grassroots leaders, what would a poverty reduction program look from their perspective? And they started always community savings groups that join together and have solidarity with each other, and over time form federations of community savings groups. Taking initiatives themselves, including collecting the data about poverty. So in a sense, doing what the government or the statistical offices or the World Bank should have done is actually collecting hard data on non-food needs and the costs. Linking their work in networks and federations, which then give them a voice not only in their community, not only in their ward, not only in their city, but in their nation. When I last heard, 5 of the grassroots leaders were going to see their national government's census bureau to say, look, we've got much better data on urban poverty than you have, and see whether there was a basis for a decent dialogue. So how do we address the lack of data? In most informal settlements, there's no data on health. No data on health. Vital registration systems aren't working, so you haven't got causes of death. Hospital records are not being digitized, so you can't call on them to look at what's happening. So if we want to work in informal settlements, it's usually with a complete absence of knowledge of what the most serious causes of death, injury and illness are. Censuses, in theory, cover every house. If they cover informal settlements, they never return the data to informal settlements to allow them to plan. There's some fantastic exceptions. Most of Latin America falls outside these generalizations. As we noted in the beginning, there's often no maps, there's no addresses. How can you run a survey when you can't choose households by particular addresses because they have no address, and you can't locate them by street name because there's no street name? The federations formed by slum dwellers, formed by shack dwellers, which are now active in 30 nations, all of them formed around women's savings groups. Part of their strategy to get action on their poverty is to do detailed surveys. So the Zimbabwe Homeless People's Federation have this slum profiles, each informal settlement in Harare, with details of who lives there, the population, the infrastructure, the services, the priorities. And they produce very professional, very detailed digital maps. But this isn't just a digital map. It's a digital map that's been produced by knowledge of on the ground. It isn't just a drone going overhead. It's combining ground truth data with mapping data to get these sort of plans that allow you to make choices. It's also returning that data to community organizations, allow them to be the ones that discuss the priorities. And these informal settlement surveys collect an enormous amount of very, very detailed, interesting stuff. It includes people's assessment of local institutions, local services, community priorities, surprising amount of detail on health. They usually identify the main diseases, even if sometimes you have to make some heroic guesses as to what fever was. Was it malaria or was it other some source? But because I and my community are collecting our data, and I'm coming to you, local government officials, and then showing you all the data I've collected, you then begin to see us as allies as people to work with, rather than as squatters that you want to ignore. So the way that communities generate the data on poverty and their priorities for poverty reduction becomes the basis for changing the relationship with local government. These informal settlements have been done in 6,000 informal settlements in over 700 cities.